different areas, fairly different, and I'm going to try to pull them all together at the end and have a debate about whether I do that successfully or not. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the research I did for my PhD thesis on the digitization of Tibetan texts. And there's some really interesting tales, I think, about the blending of digital and physical here. Next, I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on in my spare time with a foundation that my husband actually started a few years ago, a nonprofit foundation that involves building a library for a tribe, the Parakuyu Maasai in Tanzania, so a nomadic tribe that has no written language. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the heck this has to do with Bodleian and what we're up to these days. We're opening a new library in 2015, a refurbished library. And so I'll talk a little bit about how the projects that I've been working on outside of sort of my official capacity have been feeding into what we're thinking for the library. So to start in Tibet, or more generally the Tibetan diaspora, in 2007 I started my DPhil at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I wanted to study this question of what impact was digitization having on scholarship in the humanities, and in particular with scholars' relationship with their library. So if we think loosely, and this would be an interesting place to debate the question of, is the library the humanities scholars' laboratory? But if we take that as sort of a given right now, that this is the laboratory for humanities scholars, what happens if you put the equivalent of their chemicals online? Do you still need this physical space? And so that was the question I was really trying to answer. And the humanities is just far too broad, too heterogeneous to really look at that across the entire scope of the humanities. So I had to narrow it down, and I started looking at what digitization projects, focusing particularly on digitization of rare materials, were particularly successful in their field. And I kept coming across these projects in Tibetan and Himalayan studies that it was the first field where I talked to scholars who said to me, I absolutely could not do the work that I do without digitized rare materials. And I talked to people in other areas, history and medieval studies, who said, yeah, it's great, it's convenient, it keeps me from having to go to the library so much. But this was the first discipline that I saw where people really were dependent upon these materials. And so I thought, there's definitely something going on here. And then looking into it a little bit more, I realized there's also a second, aside from the scholars, there's a second sort of group of stakeholders that were involved in digitization, and that was practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism. And that added another sort of fascinating dynamic in a way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the examples that I came across of blending physical and digital, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I think that that's come up, and sort of my theories about it. So one of the first projects that I came across was at the time called the Tibetan and Himalayan Digital Library. It's now called the Tibetan and Himalayan Library. And they're doing these fascinating things that they've been working on for about 10 years with a lot of data that they have about, there we go. They have lots of maps and sort of geographical maps of Tibet in particular. And so you can go to these maps and you can sort the buildings by their function. In this case, they're all color-coded. And you can click on one of the buildings and you can see photographs of the inside of the buildings. And they have these overlaid floor plans of some of the monasteries, some of the monastery and temple spaces. And you can overlay them, you can sort of click them on and off, you can walk around, and where you see little click time symbols. They have a 3D version, but I couldn't get a good screenshot of it as well, where you can literally sort of virtually walk through the monastery. You can click on a statue, and up pops a little video of a monk telling you the significance of the statue. They've taken it even further in that often the monk is speaking in Tibetan, and they have the transcript, and you can click on dictionary in the word to look something up as you're going, or you can bring up the translation of what he's saying instead of the transcript. So it's a very complex, very intricate kind of work and kind of site. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center. They put about 1 million pages a year online of Tibetan texts. And it's very straightforward digitization. Lots of good old-fashioned metadata, outstanding metadata, in fact, and just bitonal page images of Tibetan texts. And so you can, the fascinating thing to me, I need to get one more thing out of my bag. The fascinating thing to me about the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center was not just the digitization that they were doing, but what was actually happening with, what people were doing with the digitized Tibetan texts. So there was this really amazing sort of seamlessness with which I saw both the scholars and practitioners go back and forth from digital to print, from print to digital, and from digital back to print. So it was very interesting to me. So TBRC themselves, this is a Tibetan book, they're wrapped in cloth, and it is a series of unbound pages loosely put between boards. So this is all, they're all unbound. Kind of awkward, you can imagine. They have special readers that you can use to, when you read this, you can kind of put the leaves like that and you can read it and you can page through it. I can pass this around. So this is one of the books that the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, they actually sell. If you drop it, you have to put it back together. Otherwise, feel free to have a look at it. It's one of the things that they do is they'll digitize all these pages, but they'll also, if you want a print copy, you can call them up and they'll make you a print copy, and they'll send it out. They've also worked in particular with monasteries who've lost their libraries. So most of these texts that they've digitized are texts that people, when they fled Tibet in the 50s, brought texts with them. And so most of them ended up in India. And so a lot of people, a lot of monasteries lost their libraries at this point. And so TBRC, this is one of the director of TBRC now. And this is a small section of a library that they've created completely from a shelf list that they had of what was in the library, and they've recreated it from the texts in the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center. And then this is a monastery in Kathmandu that is digitizing. You can see they have the monks key in texts to create digital versions. And what was fascinating to me about this, because I saw a lot of this kind of going on in different contexts, what was fascinating to me about this was that in honor of a celebration of the monastery's, the founder of the monastery's 100th birthday, they reformatted all these texts and distributed them in a little Filofax version, which was far more convenient, because what they were going to do is have you can see that that's not terribly convenient to sort of walk around with. And so they were having this big festival with monks walking around and doing readings, and it's awkward to walk around with the traditional format. So I thought, this is really interesting to me. There's an important lesson here about sort of format and functionality, and that sometimes the digital technology is a really fantastic means of distribution, but it's not necessarily the most convenient endpoint depending on the situation you're in. But I thought, maybe there's something about why people keep going back to print. Is there something there in print that, is there a sort of physicality that's important to people? And in this case, important to sort of the practitioners. And this is, I thought maybe it's this format for Pothi, maybe it has sort of, this is called, this format's called the Pothi, P-O-T-H-I. I thought maybe it has this sort of significance, this religious significance for practitioners, and that's why they keep going back to it. But that doesn't explain the Filofax, right? Clearly there's not a lot of sort of religious significance in a Filofax.